The purpose of this video is to explain the guidelines for the response paper assignment. Before getting started, however, there are a few preliminary points I need to make about this video. The video you are about to watch was originally made for a section of this class that ran in the fall semester of 2020. For that reason, the specific due dates that I discuss in this video will not match the due dates for your particular section. However, the general points about the number of response papers you need to complete, how to submit your response papers, how to write your response papers, and how I will grade your paper remain the same and still apply to your section. To find the precise due dates for your section, please consult the Moodle page for our class, the syllabus, or the weekly instruction letters. In addition, if there is anything in this video you find confusing or need clarification about, then please do not hesitate to contact me via email.
The purpose of this video will be to take you through some of the basic guidelines of the response paper assignment. I'm going to show you how to submit your assignment, tell you what the basic requirements are, what you'll be expected to do, and tell you a little bit about how I will be grading your assignments. So first, I'm here on the Moodle page for our course, and I'm in the let me get over to the general course information and resources area. And you'll find a number of important documents here, but for us, the important document you will find are the response paper guidelines. So open this up, and I'm going to use this document to take you through all the major components of the assignment. And also, just for your reference, right, if you want to go back up and look up anything I'm talking about, this table of contents here is linked, so you can simply click on the section that you're interested in and go back and read over that specific part. So let's begin by saying a few things just about the basic purpose of the assignment, what you're doing. So the purpose of the response paper assignment is to give you some practice with some fundamental philosophical skills. And those fundamental philosophical skills are reading philosophical texts closely and then engaging with the argument of the text and criticizing the argument. So I'll say one thing up front about the purpose of the assignment. You'll notice that here I've written that the purpose is to criticize an argument, and the vast majority of the time, as we'll see in the prompts for the response papers, I will be requiring you to explain the argument that you're writing about, and then after that criticize it or argue against it. And you might say, well, why do I have to argue against the point being made by this philosopher? What if I agree with the point being made? What if I think it's a good one? So the first thing to say is that's a fair question, but I would emphasize that this is really just, it has a teaching purpose. So for me, when I read your paper, I don't necessarily suppose that what you're writing is your own personal view, your own personal considered view, or that you necessarily agree with it, right? This is a pedagogical exercise that is just intended to force you to think more critically about the reading. And you're always going to think more critically about a reading or an argument if you think about what might be going wrong with it. So what I encourage you to do is just sort of put aside your own personal views about whatever the philosopher is saying and just think of what are some possible problems with this argument. How are some ways that it might be incomplete? What are things I can criticize? Because that's going to force you to think much more deeply and much more critically about the argument, as opposed to simply agreeing with whatever the philosopher says. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that let's go over some of the basic requirements for the assignment. So first, it says here that there are 10 opportunities to complete the response papers throughout the course of the semester. And there are a couple of ways to see this, including when the due dates are for each paper. So if we go back to Moodle and let's check out the syllabus, and we go to the course schedule. So here we are in week 1, but the response papers aren't actually due until, week 3. Okay, so here's the first week in which we have a response paper due. You'll notice in the assignments area that listed there is response paper 1. It is due on September 11th by the end of the day. Okay, so now one thing you'll notice is that the requirement said there are 10 opportunities, but if you look closely, it also says you're only required to complete 4 of them. Right, so if you continue scrolling down, you'll see response paper 1, response paper 2, 3, 4, even go closer to the end of the course, 7, 8, right? If you go through the entire course schedule and the syllabus, you'll see there are 10 opportunities. So why is this? And what does it mean to say you only have to complete 4? So there are 10 opportunities to complete response papers, but you get to choose which 4 of those you will complete with one important caveat, right? And that important caveat is the following. You have to complete at least 2 of the first 5 response papers. And I do this for a couple of reasons, right? The main reason is that I don't want you to save all 4 response papers for the very end of the semester, which often would happen when I didn't have this requirement. It's just going to force you to space out your work a little better. It eases up the grading load on me at the end of the semester, and it also forces you to be a little spread out a little more the close consideration of the readings that you do when you complete the response paper assignments. So, to sum up, you have to complete 4 papers. There are 10 opportunities. You complete whichever 4 you want, as long as you do at least 2 of the first 5 opportunities. I should also say that you could do more than 2 in the first half of the course if you want. You could, if you wanted, to complete response paper 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the beginning and be done. That's fine. You just have to do at least 2 in the of the first 5 papers. And this means that if you don't do at least 2 of the first 5 papers, so let's say out of response papers 1 through 5, you only complete 1 of them, that means you'll necessarily be taking a 0 for one response paper assignment, which is not really something you want to do, because the response papers are worth 50 points each, which is a significant chunk of your grade. Finally, often students will ask me, am I allowed to complete more than 4 response papers, either for extra credit or to complete to replace a lower response grade? And my answer here is no. But one thing so that is to say, you're only allowed to complete 4 of them. And so once you've done 4, any other response papers you would turn in, I simply would not factor into your grade. However, to put you somewhat more at ease, if you do the first response paper and you don't score as highly as you would like, which to some extent is to be expected, right? It's your first paper, and as you're getting used to the course material, as you're getting more used to philosophy, it's natural that perhaps your later papers would be better than your first one. And one thing I'll look for at the end of the semester when I'm adjusting borderline grades between A and B or B and C, etc., one thing I will look for is consistent improvement on the response papers. So if on the first one you didn't do so well, but you worked hard, you showed improvement, consistent improvement over the semester, that's something I take into account when I'm bumping up grades at the very end. Okay, so like I said, you can find all those due dates for when each specific paper is due on the course schedule. There's also one other place you can find it. If we go back up to the table of contents for this document, you notice at the very end it says response paper assignment descriptions. This is where you'll find a couple of things. Most importantly, perhaps, this is where you'll find the specific prompts for each response paper. So each response paper will have a set of prompts that you'll choose from when deciding which one to respond to. But you can also see the due dates here. So for example, if we just go to response paper 1, you'll see that it's due Friday, September 11th at 11:59. Response paper 2, Friday, September 18th, etc., etc. So there are multiple ways to see when the due dates for the response papers are. But again, when you see response paper 1 due, don't get too worried. If you don't want to submit response paper 1, for instance, as one of your papers, you don't have to. You get to choose which 4. All right. So those are some of the basic points. Let's say a few things about the length and format. So overall, there is a length requirement for the paper, and that length requirement is 600 words. So, and that includes words of text. So it doesn't include your name or title or the section headings that we'll get to in a minute. It also doesn't include your entire bibliography section. The 600 words is just the actual written words of text that you have in the paper. So 600 words is the minimum requirement. You are free to go above that. There is no sort of maximum requirement. It would not be necessary, but if you wrote thousands of words, it's very likely that you would be rambling at some point, but I wouldn't take off points just because the paper went long. So the paper has to be 600 words. But within that, there's a little more detail that needs to be explained. So to see this, the first thing you need to see is that it is required that your paper is broken up into the following sections: explanation, analysis, and bibliography. And furthermore, not only broken up into those sections, but you need to have these exact section headings. So if I were you, if I were starting the paper, the very first thing I would do, you pull up your Word document, I would type out one explanation, 2 analysis, and 3 bibliography. And might as well make them bold. So the very first thing I would do is I would type out those exact section headings, right? And if you want, right, so it's helpful, it's standard and helpful to put your name on the paper, even though I will have your name, of course, through the Moodle grading. And you might put a title if you want. So, for instance, if we were going to write this on response paper 1 and Aristotle and the highest good, maybe something like, what is the highest good? So that's fine. You can have things like that. But that isn't really required or necessary. What is required is that you have these section headings: explanation, analysis, bibliography. So before you type anything, I would just format your paper in this way. Okay, now, once you have that in place, then we can say a little more about word requirements. In the explanation section, which as I'll explain very shortly, this is where you're just explaining the argument you're writing about. That needs to be at least 200 words. Likewise, the analysis section needs to be also at least 200 words. So the paper as a whole needs to be 600. Each of the main sections needs to be at least 200. The reason I do this is just to prevent papers where, for instance, students will spend 550 words explaining the argument and then barely have anything in their analysis section where they're not really giving much thought to criticizing the argument. So I want some level of balance, so at least 200 words in each section. But again, you can certainly go above and beyond that. There's no ceiling, as it were, to the amount of words. Okay, so the paper should be formatted like that. We're going to be getting into the explanation and analysis sections in a minute, which is the main basis on which your paper is graded. But I'll start off by saying a few things about the bibliography. So the bibliography is the area of the paper where you cite every single source that you use. And I want to say a few things about sources in the moment, and we'll come back to this a little later. There's only one source you're required to use. And that one source you're required to use is the citation for the reading that you're writing about. So for instance, in the present example, if you do response paper 1, it's on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So you might say, well, wait a minute, how do I know what the citation information is for that? We don't have an actual physical textbook, all the readings are online. Excellent question. If you go back up to the table of contents and go to bibliography, I actually have the citation information here for all of our course readings. So for Aristotle Nicomachean Ethics, which would be the subject of response paper 1, were you to do it, you could simply take this information here and put it right into your bibliography. Right? And so that's the only source you're required to cite. Now, you might say, well, can I use other sources? And the answer is yes, you can use other sources, with some exceptions that we will talk about as far as appropriate sources. But you can use other sources, and if you do use them, they also need to be cited here. But don't feel like you have to, right? Many of the best papers will just simply focus in on the reading itself, and that's perfectly fine. So this is the only thing you would need to absolutely cite. So when you're setting up your paper, this might be the second thing I would do. Go ahead and immediately grab the citation information for your specific reading, stick it in your bibliography. All right, so that's the bibliography section, not too much to say about that. Let's get more into the meat of the paper, and specifically let's talk about the explanation section. So as I said, the response paper has these two major parts: the explanation section, where all you are doing is explaining the argument you're writing about, and an analysis section. That's where you're criticizing the argument you're writing about, or giving a philosophical evaluation of it. Now, to see more clearly what you need to do, let's just take an example of the prompts for one specific response paper. And the one I have listed here, these are the prompts for response paper 1. So if you went to the section 5 of this document, clicked on response paper 1, these are the exact prompts you would see. And you'll see here that there are 3 prompts. And so what you don't have to, you do not have to, and you should not write about all of them. You should choose just one of these prompts and write about it. So in the current example, I'm just using essay prompt 1 of response paper 1. And so let's just read through this so you get an idea of what the prompt is like. So 1 would say, one of Aristotle's primary goals in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics is to demonstrate that there is a final or highest good at which all of our actions aim. His argument for this claim is primarily found in chapters 1 and 2 of Book 1, although claims he makes in other chapters are relevant as well. Explain and criticize Aristotle's argument for the claim that there is a single highest good that is the end of human action. So first, the prompt tells you Aristotle is going to argue that there's a single highest good that is the final end of all human action. So what you need to do then is identify how does Aristotle argue for that claim, and your explanation of how Aristotle argues for that claim would go in your explanation section, and then you need to criticize it or critique the argument, and your criticism or critique would go in the analysis section. So that's the basic structure. Now you also notice here in the prompt I say here are some questions to consider, and I list out some questions. One thing I'll say about this, you don't need to feel like you need to respond to every one of the questions that I've outlined there. They're really just to help you, right? So I'm just throwing out some questions that should help you get going and start to think about Aristotle's argument, but you shouldn't go through and say, if I don't provide an answer to every single one of these questions, then I'm going to get marked off. That's not the case. You might end up answering all the questions, that's fine too, but they're really just there to help you, so don't get hung up on thinking you need to answer every single one of them. So all the prompts are going to take that basic format, explain, identify the argument that you need to be writing about, and give you some questions to help you. Okay, so in terms of your explanation section, what should its structure be? What are some things that you need to keep in mind when completing it? Now, the first thing I'll say is some of the points I'm going to go over here will assume that you've already watched the lecture video on logic and structure of argument. I'm going to appeal to concepts like premises and conclusion and argument. So if you haven't watched that video, I'd actually suggest you probably stop now and go watch that, because what I say from now on will assume those points. Okay, so in your explanation section, when you are trying to explain in as detailed and clear a fashion as possible what the philosopher is saying, there are really 3 questions that you should keep in mind. So question 1, what is the conclusion of the argument? What position is the author arguing for? And actually, let's look at it in this schema. So the first thing that you need to ask yourself is, what is it that the author is trying to show is true? And, to some extent, the prompt has already helped you identify this. So, for instance, in our hypothetical paper here, I might even start off my explanation section with a sentence of the following sort. And of course, you don't all need to use this exact sentence. It's just saying a sentence. If you have a sentence like this in your explanation section, then I can see you're sort of on the right track here. You might say, so in this selection from the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that there is a single highest good of human life. Okay, so what does a sentence like this do? It comes out immediately and it tells the reader, this is the conclusion that the author is arguing for. This is the goal of the author's writing. And so if you come out and you have identified exactly what that conclusion is, then that's good. You're off to a good start. And the reason you're off to a good start is because once you've identified the conclusion, then the next question you should ask yourself is, what are the premises that the author is using? What are the most fundamental claims or reasons or pieces of evidence that the author is using to establish this conclusion? So I want to say a few things about this. First, as you know, in many of our lessons, I outline arguments in standard form, where I'll say P1, P2, P3 conclusion, for instance. And so students will ask me, well, do I need to do that in this paper? For instance, well, let's bring this back. For instance, after I've said this is the conclusion, do I need to say something like, below is an outline of Aristotle's argument, and then say P1, and fill that out with whatever it is, P2, fill that out, P3, and conclusion. Do I need to actually have a sort of a standard form argument outline in my paper, or can I just explain it in a more informal fashion? And my answer is that either of those would be acceptable. Personally, I find it very helpful to outline arguments in this fashion, but you might think it just is confusing you. You're not sure exactly what the premises are, what's a premise or what's a reason for a premise. So if it's causing you consternation and grief, don't feel that you need to outline the argument in standard form in that fashion. If you do, that's fine. But what I'm more looking for is that you explain in a clear and detailed fashion what are the main reasons or pieces of evidence that Aristotle in this case is giving for why there is a single highest good of human life. Another thing that you would, of course, want to do in your explanation section is define your terms, right? So what you're saying that Aristotle's conclusion is that there's a single highest good. What do you mean by highest good, for instance, right? There might be crucial terms the author is using that the reader would need to know what they mean in order to really understand what you're writing about. So when identifying the premises, it's not absolutely required or necessary that you have a standard argument form, but I am looking to see that you have a sense of here are the premises for the conclusion. Then the third question is, so you have the premises, here is the conclusion, and after that, you might say, well, what are the reasons the author gives to think these premises are true? Right, so if P1 is one reason why or piece of evidence the author gives for the conclusion, then the author should also provide some justification or some reason to think that premise is true. Now, this may not be the case for all premises. In a philosophical argument, oftentimes it's the case that some premises are just obvious or everyone would accept, but there might be one or two crucial premises which are more controversial, which would cause more disagreement. And for that reason, the author would likely spend more time defending that premise. Or if they failed to do so, you as a charitable person engaging in argument with Aristotle or whoever the author is, should think about how might the author justify this claim? What are the reasons they might have in mind for thinking this is true? So this is the general schema. Identify the conclusion. What are the premises that support that conclusion? Why should we think that the premises are true? If you address all three of those questions in as clear and detailed fashion as you possibly can, trying to really enter into the philosopher's reasoning and explain why they believe what they do, then you'll be off to a great start for your explanation section. So what about the analysis? Let me summarize one other point. Again, one way to think about what I'm looking for is your paper should completely explain the argument you're writing about to the extent that someone who's not in this class or acquainted with philosophy but is intelligent should be able to read what you've written and fully understand everything they need to know about the argument. Okay, so what about the analysis section? So in the analysis section, this is where you explain why you think the author's argument is incorrect. And to some extent, I'm not going to say too much about how to do this well now, because one of my hopes is that as we move throughout the course of the semester, you'll get more used to philosophical argument, you'll get better at it, and so you'll sort of learn by doing. But here, one thing I will say is this. One sentence that, if you have it in your paper, really lets me know that you are on top of it in terms of the structure of the paper, is a sentence like this. And again, you don't need to have this exact sentence, but if you have a sentence of the sort, Aristotle's argument is unsound because, for instance, premise 1 is false. So this isn't actually the most wonderful sounding sentence, but the purpose of the sentence is I'm going to explain to you why Aristotle's argument is incorrect or unsound. And the reason it's incorrect or unsound is I'm going to argue because premise 1 is false, or premise 2, or premise 3. What you've done is you've signaled to the reader, I'm going to criticize this specific claim of Aristotle's. And, of course, if all the premises are necessary in the argument, then knocking down one of them knocks down the whole argument. So I'm going to criticize this specific premise of Aristotle, and I'm going to do so, again, in a clear and detailed fashion that exhibits or demonstrates a lot of critical thinking. So if you have a sentence of that sort in your paper, then it doesn't mean that in and of itself will get you a perfect score, but it does mean you're on the right track, because now you're thinking systematically, right? You have the outline of the argument. Do I agree with P1? No, I think P1 is wrong. I'm going to explain why. And sometimes students will ask me, am I allowed to criticize more than one premise of the author's argument? And the answer is yes, you can. But I think some of the best papers actually just stick to saying, I'm going to talk just about this claim in particular. A lot of the best papers go deeper than they do wide, right? Which just means instead of talking about a bunch of things at a superficial level, they spend more time and are more detailed about just one thing. And some of the best papers will do that. Okay, so again, I hope that you'll get more familiar with philosophical argument as we move through the class, but those are some general guidelines about what I'm looking for. Alright, so in terms of citation, just a few things to say here. We've already talked about the bibliography, but your paper should also have in-text citations. And so, and here we need to make an important distinction between direct quotes and paraphrases. So here's what your paper should not have, right? So in your paper, you should never have a sentence of the following sort. Aristotle says, and then you drop in a direct quote, and then you say Aristotle, page 15 or whatever. Okay, now what is wrong with this? Well, first of all, what isn't wrong with it is this part. It's fine that you have the author's last name and the page number. That's how I want you to do in-text citations. But you should never have a direct quote, right? And the reason you shouldn't have any direct quotes is this is actually a very short assignment. It's only required to be 600 words. So I really want to see you putting the author's words in your own words instead of using direct quotations. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, to do this in the same sort of way, instead you might say, Aristotle believes that, and fill in the blank X, and Aristotle 15. So what is X? Well, X is just whatever claim you're explaining. So X could be, Aristotle believes that there is a single highest good of human life. And this would be a paraphrase, because here we're imagining you're not doing a direct quotation of the text. You're not using quotation marks and saying, these are the exact words that Aristotle said. You're saying, I read this thing that Aristotle said on page 15, and now I'm going to explain it to you in your own words. And the important point is that even though you're not using Aristotle's exact words, you're just paraphrasing Aristotle, you would still need a citation. Because the reason for in-text citation isn't just when you use a direct quote, it's to demonstrate that so if you're attributing some claim to Aristotle that he believes there's a single highest good, then that means there must be some page where Aristotle says that. And so to prove that this is actually something Aristotle thinks, you need to identify the exact page where Aristotle makes that claim. So, to sum up, no use of direct quotations, and all paraphrases should be cited. In addition, for paraphrases, one thing I really look for is that you put paraphrases in your own words that shows your understanding. You use your own examples. Because oftentimes what I'll see with paraphrase is that a paraphrase will sound an awful lot like a direct quotation. It just won't have quotation marks, which technically speaking is plagiarism, but more problematically, because it's usually unintentional, more problematically, it just doesn't show your understanding of the text. And that's what I'm really looking for you to do. Take what the author is saying, put it in your own words that shows your understanding, use your own examples, that sort of thing. That'll really show me that you truly understand the points the author's making. Okay, so in-text citation for all paraphrases. I won't say too much about plagiarism other than I do look for it, and it is something I take seriously, and it will result in you getting a 0 on your assignment. But I want to make another point as well about the kinds of sources you should use. So besides the reading you're required to cite, of course, if you want to use other sources, they should be peer-reviewed academic sources, and that means things like Wikipedia, although Wikipedia is a great site in general, just not proper for this assignment. Blogs or internet discussion forums, online class notes posted by other professors. These are not things that are okay to cite in this assignment. However, if you are looking for other sources, if you're looking for further explanation, then there's a few things I would recommend. I have some links here to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and both of those have a number of articles written that are peer-reviewed that will give you basic background information to many philosophical topics. So if you're looking for further sources, I would actually start there, and that would be perfectly acceptable. And I actually have some examples of how to cite those sources, for instance, right here. So if you follow this format, then you can cite those sources in your bibliography. Okay, so what else? Yeah, so the final thing here is grading. Overall, the response paper is worth 50 points. There's 4 of them. That's 200 points total. That's 25% of your grade. The breakdown for each specific response paper will be the following. So if you meet the basic requirements, the stuff we've already talked about, using in-text citations properly, meeting the word requirement, submitting the paper on time. Basically, if you can answer yes to all these questions, then you should certainly get 20 out of 20. The rest of the points will be each 15 for explanation and 15 for analysis. And basically the questions here is stuff I've already gone over, but you can see I have this basic grade scale where 15 is excellent, 12 is good, 7 is average, etc. When necessary, I might go in between those numbers, but that gives you a general sort of idea. And a general comment about grading, especially in your analysis section, so the best papers that would receive, for instance, an excellent 15 out of 15 grade would be those papers that show the most critical thinking, the most creativity, the most real philosophical thought about the issue at hand. So if you don't get, a top grade on the analysis section, or you don't get as high as you would like to, it doesn't mean you did a bad job, but you should really look at this as an endeavor, an improvement over the course of the semester. And again, that's one thing I'm looking for. So I would really encourage you to take feedback on the papers and try to improve in the future, and not get too caught up if, in fact, the first grade isn't one that you're necessarily happy with. And in terms of feedback, how that will work is after I've graded your paper, you'll get a message through Moodle saying that if you would like my comments, please just send me a quick email and I'll send them to you. And so that will be the procedure for getting comments. If you just send me a quick email, then as soon as possible, I will send you my comments on your paper. And if you do get those, then I would encourage you to use them productively so that you can show improvement through the course of the semester. Okay, so I think that's everything I want to say about the response papers. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and I will see you in the next video.